Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into one of the darkest family histories I've ever found. A story that was almost erased from the ledgers of Georgia itself. You probably won't survive this one without glancing at the corners of your room a few times. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The plantation had no name when I found it. Locals just called it the house that shouldn't have stood. It leaned like a wounded animal against the low Georgian hills, its shutters crooked, its porch rotted. The wind that crossed its fields moved, as if it had learned to step quietly. They said the orchard bloomed even in drought years, that peaches the color of blood still hung heavy each June. The road to it was mostly dust and vines. A half-mile in, the air changed. It had a thickness to it, like breath left behind. My lantern flickered, though there was no wind now, and I remember thinking that the land itself had not yet forgiven what was done here. They told me the Whitcomb family once owned it. That was the only name that ever came up before the story broke off into silence. There were rumors, of course, something about sons that never left, and a woman who prayed not to God, but to the soil. I didn't believe any of it until I stepped onto the porch and heard the boards creak in rhythm, as if welcoming me back. Inside, the air was colder. A smell lingered, not of rot, but of lavender that had died long ago. The parlor still had its drapes, stiff with dust. The portraits along the wall stared in muted accusation. Men in cotton suits, women in lace, all of them looking a little too directly at the viewer. I brushed one frame and the glass fell inward with a sigh. The face beneath was gone, the canvas eaten away by mildew. Only her outline remained, a woman's silhouette, high-necked, tall, proud. They said the Whitcombs were one of the oldest planter families in coastal Georgia. They built their wealth on indigo, then cotton, and then something no one could name. Around 1847, something happened that made the county registrar strike their name from record. The house was sold, burned, rebuilt, and finally abandoned. But the orchard somehow never died. I walked to the back veranda, where the view opened to 30 acres of twisted trees. Every branch bent toward the house. The fruit was still there, small, pink, and glimmering faintly under the moonlight. It shouldn't have been possible this late in the year. Yet I could smell it from here, sweet, almost human. There was a journal on the veranda table, swollen with rain. The ink had bled, but one entry survived. The house remembers what we did. The handwriting was a woman's. I flipped another page and saw the date, June 2, 1847. The line beneath read, "He will not go to the fields anymore. He is too pale. I have kept him near me." There was no signature, but the back of the book had a single initial carved into the leather EW. The first night I stayed, I couldn't sleep. The air carried the sound of something moving between the orchard rows. Soft, rhythmic, like someone dragging their feet through wet leaves. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard a woman humming. A lullaby, maybe, but with notes that didn't quite belong to any tune I knew. I sat up, holding the lantern close, listening. The sound stopped the instant I breathed too loudly. When dawn came, the orchard looked freshly tilled, as if something had been unearthed and buried again. Later, an old farmer from the nearby town stopped by to warn me. He said, "You're digging into a story best left in the ground." When I asked what he meant, he spat and pointed toward the orchard. That lady fed her trees things no field should ever grow from. He wouldn't stay long enough to explain. He just told me the Whitcomb matriarch was the kind who smiled when you confessed, then made you sin again. I looked back at the house, its second-floor windows shuttered. For a moment, I thought I saw a face behind the glass, pale, almost luminous. The angle of it was wrong. Too low, as if someone were crouching. That night, the humming returned. Closer this time. It's strange how quickly a place begins to speak once you stop fighting it. By the third night, I could almost tell where each creak belonged, which sigh of wind came from which corridor. The house was not empty. It was patient. It had waited nearly 2 centuries for someone to listen again. In the parlor, beneath the portrait frames, I found faint scratches in the wainscoting. At first I thought they were just marks from furniture, but when the lantern hit them right, the words appeared in shallow relief. She kept us for herself. I traced the letters and the wood flaked beneath my touch, revealing something darker underneath. A stain that wasn't paint. The air shifted then, the same way it does when you realize someone else is breathing in rhythm with you. I turned, expecting to see the door move, but only the drapes stirred, as if brushed by a passing body. I left that night with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain, this was no ordinary ruin. The plantation had been stripped of its name for a reason. Whatever the Whitcombs did here wasn't just sin, it was inheritance. And if you listen closely, even now, the orchard still hums. If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. They called her the Lady of the Orchards. Not Eleanor, not Miss Whitcomb, just the Lady. Titles suited her better than names. Names end, titles persist. The first record I found of her was in an 1841 newspaper clipping preserved at the Savannah Historical Society. It wasn't a scandal or obituary. It was a society column, praising her. Exceptional dedication to cultivation and refinement. The writer mentioned her orchard, how it bloomed longer than any other in the county, and how visitors were always struck by the fragrance of her perfume. Something like roses steeped in vinegar. But what struck me most was a single line. Near the end, her sons are fine young men, though their resemblance to each other is unsettling. Eleanor Whitcomb lived in that house with 2 boys, Thomas and Julian. Their father had died, or so the papers said, of a fever brought on by the summer rains. Some claimed he'd vanished entirely, taken by the swamp behind the fields. Others whispered that Eleanor had buried him herself, under the tree that never stopped blooming. The lady wore black long after mourning season ended. She was tall, always gloved, and always smiling, the way people do when they're quietly daring you to look closer. Neighbors said she rarely attended church, but sent crates of fruit to the pastor every Easter. No one ever refused them. The Whitcomb plantation was different from others even then. The fields were smaller than the neighboring estates, but the house was older, more European in its design. Visitors noticed the library first. A 2-story chamber filled with medical texts, agricultural manuals, and something far stranger, an entire shelf labeled Inheritance Studies. The bindings were worn, as though read too often. When I stepped into that library myself, the air felt preserved, sealed by time. Dust floated in heavy sheets. A candle had been melted down to a silver stub on the desk, its wax forming the shape of fingers reaching for the floor. On the far wall, beneath a window shaded with cobwebs, hung a portrait of Eleanor Whitcomb. She was painted in ivory silk, her hand resting lightly on the head of a child. The artist had been skilled. Her expression hovered between pride and warning. There was something in the boy's eyes, too. He couldn't have been more than 8, yet the gaze was too aware, too still. His features blurred into hers, as if the painter had run out of colors to separate them. When I leaned closer, I noticed something else. Along the bottom edge of the canvas, almost hidden in shadow, were faint brushstrokes forming another face. Half finished, smaller, tucked against her dress like an afterthought. The youngest son, perhaps. That night, I dreamed of her. She stood in the orchard, the moon slicing her in half. Her dress moved like smoke. I couldn't see her face, only her hands, long pale, the nails faintly red. She was humming that same lullaby I'd heard before. And when she turned, I realized the sound wasn't coming from her mouth at all. It was coming from the trees. The next morning, I explored the servant quarters. The floorboards there were soft, eaten by age, but the rooms were still lined with iron hooks and rusted chains meant for hanging lanterns, or something else. In one corner, I found a small cedar box containing locks of hair tied with blue ribbon. Each one had a tiny label written in cursive, TJW, LW, HM, and several others without initials at all. That's when I understood something terrible. Eleanor hadn't just catalogued her fruit. She catalogued her people. Local oral histories describe her as both generous and cruel. She'd nurse a sick slave back to health one day and have another whipped for breaking a tool the next. But her punishments were peculiar. They say she often made her sons watch. A letter from a neighboring planter dated August 1845 reads, Mrs. Whitcomb has taken to keeping her sons close. The eldest is of age now but does not court. The mother insists it is due to frailty. Though the boy appears strong, I confess there is something about their bond that chills the air. The lady speaks of purity of blood, with a fervor that makes even the preacher uneasy. Purity of blood. The phrase repeats in every surviving document I've found. Her letters, her ledger, her sermons written in the margins of scripture. She saw herself as a vessel of divine lineage, meant to preserve something holy through her sons. As I read deeper into her notes, it became clear what that meant. She believed her family's bloodline carried a gift, one that could refine the lesser stock of mankind. Her orchard, she claimed, would bear witness to the union of perfect lineage and perfect labor. It sounds like madness now, but in 1847, in the fevered air of the South, such ideas could take root. By the time the Whitcomb name was erased from county record, Eleanor was said to have aged without truly aging. Visitors swore her hair remained black, her skin untouched by sun. She was always seen at dusk, walking the orchard rows with a lantern, humming softly to the soil. Once a servant girl, Mary Ann, was found dead in the orchard ditch. No wounds, no struggle, just gone, her skin pale as wax. Eleanor insisted it was illness. She paid for the burial herself, and no one questioned it. But weeks later, peaches the color of blood appeared again, sweeter than ever. When I left the library that evening, I noticed something strange on the window glass. From the outside, the dust had been disturbed. 5 long, thin streaks, like the marks of someone dragging their fingers downward. That night, I heard knocking, not from the door, but beneath the floor, 3 times, then silence. You'd think you'd be brave enough to check. I wasn't. I sat still until dawn, listening to the orchard hum through the window. The sound was almost like breathing. If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The sons were always there. Thomas and Julian Whitcomb, born 3 years apart, raised like reflections of the same face. In the few surviving sketches, they look nearly identical, tall, pale, with that same fixed half smile their mother wore. But those who lived near the plantation swore the boys were different in one way. Julian spoke too softly, and Thomas didn't speak at all. The town remembered them only in fragments, passing through the market on their mother's errands, standing too close to her carriage, never meeting anyone's eyes. Some whispered that they slept in her room until they were nearly grown. Others said they never truly left the house at all. By 1846, The plantation had nearly collapsed under debt, yet the Whitcombs stopped selling their crops. The fields went untended. The orchard, though, remained perfect, lush, untouched by rot or drought. People came from miles away to taste its fruit. And every time someone did, Eleanor would watch them with quiet satisfaction, her sons standing behind her like shadows. I found their shared bedroom on the second floor. 2 canopy beds facing each other, draped in lace gone gray with age. On the nightstand between them lay a small wooden crucifix. Its edges were worn smooth, and the back was engraved with a single word, ours. There were no other decorations except one painting, an oil portrait of the orchard at dusk, but the trees were painted wrong. Their branches seemed to twist toward a single point, the way bodies might turn toward heat. In the background, half hidden in brush, a figure knelt among the roots. I leaned closer, squinting, and realized it was Eleanor herself. The artist had painted her hands buried in the soil. The diaries from the servants, what little survived, suggested that by then, Thomas and Julian were unwell. They'd grown pale, listless, often wandering the halls at night. The cook wrote that they refused all meat, preferring only the peaches from their mother's orchard. She noted something else. The lady makes them drink milk, boiled with honey each evening. She says it keeps their hearts clean. A clean hearts, pure blood. The same phrases repeated through her writings like prayer. I think she believed herself chosen, that she was meant to birth something beyond human, something holy through her own bloodline. In another letter, dated February 1847, Eleanor wrote her, "They are my mirrors. God made them from me. No stranger shall dilute what I have been given. The world is filthy, but here, within these walls, our line shall remain untarnished. The soil knows our secret. The soil will protect it." If that sounds like madness now, it probably was. But madness can be gentle when spoken softly enough. Neighbors stopped visiting after that spring. The last recorded guest was a Reverend Pike, who came to deliver communion. His diary mentions her sons briefly. The elder one stared through me, as though he knew what I would say before I said it. The younger trembled when I offered him the bread. I thought he might refuse, but his mother's look silenced him. I confess I felt the presence of something unsanctified in that room. I left before dusk. There's a story that one of the enslaved men tried to run that summer. He made it halfway across the orchard before Eleanor herself caught him. No one ever saw him again. The next morning, the lady hosted a Sunday picnic beneath the peach trees. Guests said the air smelled unusually sweet. When I read that, I couldn't help but think of the orchard's roots. How deep they must have run. How hungry they might have been. I stayed in their house one more night, though I can't say why. Maybe it was the historian's instinct in me. Maybe it was the voice that whispered, "Stay. You've almost seen it." At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of 2 men talking down the hall. Their voices were low, identical in tone, repeating the same phrase, "She's coming. She's coming. She's coming." I froze. The boards creaked, the sound moving closer, measured, synchronized steps, like soldiers marching in sleep. When I opened my door, the hallway was empty, but both beds in the son's room were unmade. There was another sound then, a faint dragging, like fabric brushing the floor. I followed it to the end of the corridor, where a large armoire stood. The key was still in the lock. When I turned it, the door opened on nothing but darkness and the smell of peaches gone sour. Something shifted behind the clothes, not movement exactly, more like breath. I closed it quickly and backed away. The air felt heavier then, as if the house itself were holding its breath with me. The next morning, I found muddy footprints in the hall. 2 sets. Barefoot, small. In the daylight, it was easier to pretend I'd imagined it. but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Whitcomb sons never left this house at all. Not really. Eleanor's final surviving note, scribbled on a scrap of parchment pinned to the back of a portrait, reads simply, "They will remain. I have made sure of it." Would you have stayed after that? If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The ledger was hidden behind the fireplace. I'd been staring at that hearth for hours, tracing the blackened bricks, when one loosened under my hand. It wasn't much, just a faint hollow sound, but enough to make me pry. Behind the soot-caked wall was a small cavity, wrapped in waxed cloth and string. Inside, there it was, a leather-bound ledger, swollen with age, its cover stamped with the Whitcomb family crest. The title page was written in that same elegant, obsessive hand, "Breeding Records, 1843-1847. At first I thought it was a log of livestock until I read the first line. Perfect 1. Samuel Field, Tota Clara Housed. Result viable male, notat strength promising, complexion undesirable. Reassigned to lower quarter. The next entry was worse. Each pair listed had names, not animals but people. Enslaved men and women, crossbred and categorized like specimens. The handwriting was careful, tender almost, as though the lady had written each line with affection rather than cruelty. Then, further down the page, a new column appeared, supervised by T. DJ, her son's initials. That detail made my throat close. Flipping forward, I saw the pattern evolve. The word viable appeared more often. Reject was crossed out, replaced by preserved. Beside those fainting stains, red as if she'd mixed pigment with blood. And then, halfway through the ledger, the entries changed. The names no longer belonged to enslaved couples. They were combinations, strange, unthinkable ones. Pair Fin 47 Dead Wickham Tamemv, result Suttlborn, retained for study. Pair Tun 52 Fit Whitcomb to low domestic. Result female, pale. Eyes resemble mothers. Retained within household. After that, the handwriting grew unsteady. Smudges, corrections, words scratched out. On the final page, I found this pair 6 in E, Whitcomb, To T Whitcomb. Result conceived. Bless the soil, the ink cut off there, as if the pen had fallen mid-stroke. I sat for a long time staring at that last entry. Every breath in that room felt heavier than the last. The air itself seemed to pulse, a slow, invisible heartbeat echoing through the floorboards. When I tried to close the ledger, a small folded sheet slipped from between the pages. It wasn't written by Eleanor. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike. She says it's God's will. But I think God stopped listening long ago. There was no signature, just the initials JW. That night, the wind picked up, the shutters rattled, and something slammed against the house from outside. Once, then again. I lit a lantern and peered through the cracked window. The orchard was moving. It wasn't the branches. It was the ground. Shadows shifted between the trees, slow and deliberate, like figures pacing. One paused near the edge of the field, its head tilted upward as if looking straight at me. Even from that distance, I could tell it wasn't quite human. Too tall, too thin, its limbs wrong. When lightning flickered across the sky, the orchard went still. And in that brief flash, I saw them, rows of white shapes half buried among the roots. Bones, dozens of them. By morning, the storm had passed, but the footprints remained, leading from the orchard to the veranda, stopping just below my window. I tried to convince myself it was a dream or memory playing tricks. But then I saw the smudge of red clay on the sill, shaped like a handprint, small, slender, unmistakably human. The ledger still sat on the table, open to that final page. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. Instead, I searched the room. Behind a cabinet, I found another compartment, a false panel leading to a narrow passage that descended behind the fireplace. The air down there smelled of dirt and iron. My lantern barely reached the walls, but I saw carvings all along them, crosses, names, and one phrase repeated over and over. The soil remembers. It took me to a small chamber below the floor, filled with jars, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and initials. Inside every jar was something preserved in brine: strands of hair, pieces of cloth, small, curled shapes I couldn't identify. And in the corner, an open cradle. Its wood was dark, stained beyond recognition. Inside it, a blanket embroidered with those same initials, EW. That was when I heard her voice again. Soft, almost gentle, rising from the floor itself. A lullaby, no words, just melody. I froze, listening. It came from beneath the cradle. I knelt, brushed aside the dirt, and felt the edge of a wooden trapdoor. The metal latch was rusted, but when I touched it, it moved. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some doors aren't meant to open when you're alone. When I came back upstairs, the ledger had closed itself. Outside, the orchard was blooming again. Out of season, the branches heavy with fruit that looked too red, too soft, as if they'd grown from something more than soil. The same lullaby carried through the trees, faint but steady. I could almost hear the words this time. Something about the blood that feeds the roots. I left the ledger on the desk, but even now, I remember every word written inside it. And I can't shake the thought that the lady's breeding didn't end in 1847. If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The Sunday feast was supposed to be a blessing. That's what the old diaries called it. A gathering, a tradition, a celebration of the harvest, and the renewal of the Whitcomb line. The townsfolk remembered the invitations, written in that graceful hand, sealed with wax and the faint scent of rosewater. Every year, the lady would host it beneath the peach trees. The last one took place on July 18th, 1847. I pieced together what happened from letters, church records, and the diary of a woman named Lydia Marsh, the wife of a neighboring planter. Her entry began innocently enough. Eleanor has invited us again for her orchard feast. The peaches this year are remarkable. She claims the sweetness comes from prayer. But later that night, her handwriting trembled. The air felt heavy from the start. The sons were there, Thomas pale as death, Julian fidgeting like a child. She sat between them, smiling in that calm, perfect way. When she raised her glass, the servants stood still as statues. Something was wrong. I cannot explain it, but the entire orchard felt awake. The orchard's table stretched beneath the oldest tree, dressed in white linen. Candles burned though the daylight hadn't yet dimmed. Servants moved silently, their eyes low. The guests, neighbors, tradesmen, clergy, ate slowly, uncomfortably, watching as the lady whispered instructions to her sons. Lydia's diary continued. She blessed the soil, her words soft and strange, not scripture but something older. Then she turned to her sons and told them to bring out the offering. No one knew what she meant until the boys returned, each carrying a small wooden box. Inside the first was a lock of hair tied with blue ribbon. Inside the second, a withered flower pressed between 2 pages of the Bible. Eleanor held them up as though they were relics. Blood nourishes, she said, faith binds, and flesh remembers. She made every guest eat a peach from the orchard before they left. Some refused, quietly setting theirs aside. But the lady noticed. She always noticed. 3 of those guests fell ill within the week, Lydia's husband among them. The doctor called it fever. The neighbors called it punishment. When I read that, I felt a chill that never really left me. The lady's ritual was never about celebration. It was about preservation. That feast wasn't just a meal. It was an inheritance ceremony, a way to bind outsiders to her soil, to her blood. The more I studied her records, the more it made sense, at least in the logic of madness. She'd spent years refining, her bloodline, controlling who bred, who lived, who was buried beneath her orchard. But a bloodline can't last in isolation. It needs new soil to feed it. The feast gave her that. Every guest who ate her fruit carried a piece of her family with them. That was the night her sons changed, too. A surviving servant's note described how they were led from the table at dusk. Eleanor made them kneel in front of her, the orchard humming behind them. She placed her hands on their heads and whispered, "The father's gone, but the seed remains." The servants weren't allowed to look. Those who did claimed they saw her kiss them both, on the mouth, and then command them to continue the work. The next day, the overseer vanished. His house was found empty, his horse still tethered outside. The ledgers stopped that week too. No more breeding records, no more pairings, just silence. In the months that followed, the plantation seemed to wither from the inside out. Servants fled in the night. The townspeople stopped coming near. A traveling reverend who tried to visit in the fall wrote that the orchards sang with voices that were not human. When I first read that, I laughed nervously. But now, after nights spent listening, I understand what he meant. The sound isn't a voice exactly. It's a resonance. A vibration that seeps into you until it feels like your heartbeat is syncing with the soil. One evening, I walked through the orchard myself. The trees were twisted, the bark slick with sap that looked almost dark red under my lantern. At the base of the oldest tree, I saw something small and pale, half buried. Bones, fragile as bird remains. Human. The lady had called it a feast. I stood there until I realized the ground beneath my feet was moving. Subtle, like something shifting just below the surface. The scent of peaches grew stronger, mixed with something metallic. That's when I saw them, two figures standing deeper in the grove, still as the trunks themselves. Both tall, both watching. The light caught their faces just enough to reveal the faintest glimmer of something wet, like tears or sap. I blinked, and they were gone. But I swear the branches above me swayed without wind, as if bowing. When I stumbled back to the veranda, my lantern sputtered and died. For a few seconds, I thought I could hear a woman laughing. Low, melodic, and close. The lady's laughter, perhaps. Or the echo of what she left behind. That night, I wrote one sentence in my notebook before I slept. The feast never ended. Would you have stayed after seeing that orchard? If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. They said the sound began one night in late August, a week after the feast. A strange, muffled wailing that drifted through the halls long after the candles were out. The servants whispered about it in corners, pretending not to hear. Some claimed it was the wind pressing through the floorboards. Others saw it was something living. A cry too rhythmic, too human. They called it the child beneath the floor. When I first read those accounts, I assumed they were superstition. The testimony of terrified servants, trying to explain the guilt of what they'd witnessed. But when I stood in that dining room myself, when I pressed my ear to the warped wooden floor, I heard it too. A low, wet sound, a hiccuping gasp, like a newborn struggling for its first breath. I should have left then. But curiosity is its own curse, isn't it? The floorboards in that room were uneven, the gaps dark as wounds. One plank near the table was looser than the rest. When I lifted it, the smell hit me first. Not rot exactly, but something older, sweet and foul at the same time. Underneath was packed soil, black and wet. I pushed the lantern closer. The flame quivered. There was a scrap of linen buried there. White once, now rust-colored and stiff. I tugged it free, and something inside clinked softly, a small silver rattle. Its handle was engraved with initials TBW. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. The air grew colder the longer I stared. Then, Faintly, the crying began again. Not from the soil this time, but from somewhere within the walls. I can't describe that sound properly. It wasn't loud, but it filled the room. The kind of sound that presses on your chest. It made the lantern flicker like it was gasping too. I stumbled back, tripping against one of the chairs, still set at the table. The wood groaned under my weight, and that's when I saw the carvings etched into its underside. They weren't random. They were tolly marks. Dozens of them. Each line neat, deliberate, carved by someone who had time. Maybe someone trapped here once counted the days like that. The journals said the lady began locking herself in the dining room after the feast. The servants would hear her singing through the night. Sometimes she'd speak softly, like to a baby. Sometimes she'd scold, her voice breaking into shrill whispers. One night, a slave named Ruth dared to look through the keyhole. She said Eleanor was sitting on the floor, her gown spread out like wings, something swaddled in her lap. But there was no child there, just the empty bundle of cloth rocking in her arms. Ruth disappeared 2 days later. The next month, one of the sons, Thomas, fell ill. He stopped eating, wouldn't leave his room. Julian, the younger, began pacing the halls at night, murmuring prayers. Witnesses said he spoke to the floor, telling it to keep quiet. A physician was summoned from Savannah. His surviving notes are brief. Patient exhibits severe pallor, tremors, and confusion. The mother refuses examination. The younger brother guards the door. Upon attempting to leave, I was threatened with dismissal and warned never to speak of what I'd heard through the boards. The physician never returned. The Whitcombs stopped accepting visitors altogether. When the neighbors finally came to check on the property that winter, the place was silent. The orchards bloomed out of season again, their fruit falling before it ripened. The house smelled of smoke and perfume, and in the dining room, where they found the lady sitting perfectly still, the floor had been freshly nailed shut. She told them Thomas had passed away from fever. She never let them see the body. I think that's when the house began to breathe differently. Even now, when you walk through those halls, you can feel it. A pulse through the boards, faint as heartbeat. The kind of vibration that makes your teeth ache. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was in my head. Then the lantern on the table began to move, sliding an inch toward the fireplace. The sound beneath the floor returned, louder this time, desperate. I didn't lift the boards again. I couldn't. Whatever was buried there deserved silence, not discovery. But that night, when I lay awake upstairs, I heard small footsteps pacing the corridor. They stopped outside my door. The handle turned once, softly, and then came that same wet, hiccuping sound. It wasn't the cry of a baby anymore. It was older now, sharper. Learning how to breathe. You might think ghosts are cold, but that air that crept through the door wasn't cold at all. It was warm, like something alive pressing its mouth against the keyhole. I never prayed before that night. I did then. By morning, the footprints were back, small, bare, leading from my door down toward the dining room. I followed them, step by step, until they stopped exactly where that loose plank had been. Someone, or something, had nailed it shut again. From below, and I swear, as I turned to leave, I heard a voice whisper just once, in a tone that was neither woman nor child. "Don't let her open it again." Would you have listened to that voice? Or would you have pried it open anyway? If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The orchard was the only part of the estate that never seemed to die. Even when the fields rotted and the well turned black, the peach trees glowed with an impossible sweetness, their blossoms too bright against the gray sky. They said Eleanor Whitcomb walked among them every dawn, barefoot, whispering to the soil. Sometimes she carried a small basket, sometimes a shovel, always alone. I used to think that story was poetic exaggeration until I saw the mounds. There are rows of them, uneven but deliberate, like ribs beneath the earth. The trees above each mound twist in peculiar ways, their roots swelling where they should thin. And beneath the bark of one trunk, I found a marking TW carved deep, the same initials from the rattle under the floor. That was when the pattern struck me. Each tree bore a letter, each mound a date, 1847, 1849, a harvest calendar made from the dead. The journals of the last surviving servant, Ruth's younger sister, confirmed it. She wrote, "Miss Eleanor say the orchard feed the family. Say the roots drink better when the blood fresh." I didn't believe it at first, but when I cut into the soil with my spade, the dirt blood, a dark, syrupy seep that smelled faintly of iron and something sweet, like bruised fruit left in the sun. The lady of the orchards had found a way to preserve her bloodline. Every time a child disappeared, born from those unspeakable nights in the cellar, those breeding pairs the ledger spoke of, she planted a new tree. She told her sons it was for remembrance, for legacy. She told the slaves it was for forgiveness. She told herself it was mercy. By the time the family line withered, the orchard stretched half a mile, its fruit unnaturally full and soft, its scent drawing animals from miles around. The locals began avoiding the estate entirely. Even the air felt wrong there, sweet at first, then cloying, almost suffocating. I stayed just long enough to see one tree split open in a storm. Lightning hit the upper branch, and the trunk tore apart. Inside the hollow core, not far from the roots, was a small white thing, a jawbone. Not animal. I couldn't sleep that night. The windows rattled as if something outside was trying to get in, or trying to keep me from leaving. I thought about Eleanor kneeling here, pressing tiny bundles into the ground, whispering lullabies as she covered them in soil. I wondered if she believed the orchard would keep them safe. The next morning, the wind smelled faintly of peaches and rot. And on one tree, the newest growth, a single fruit hung lower than the rest. Heavy, blood-colored, pulsing almost imperceptibly when the wind passed. I touched it. The skin was warm. That was when I heard the whisper from somewhere behind the rows. A woman's voice, brittle but kind. "Do you see how well they've grown?" I turned, and through the fog between the trees, I saw her silhouette. The dress was old, yellowed lace, the hem soaked in mud. Her hair was white as candle ash, her hands dark with soil. She was smiling. "Eleanor?" I asked, though I already knew. She nodded slowly, her eyes shining like water in moonlight. "A mother tends her children," she said softly. "You hear them, don't you? How they hum under the roots." And then I heard it too, faint, rhythmic, like breath moving through earth. That sound followed me all the way back to the house. It wasn't the cry from the floor this time. It was lower, more patient. A lullaby turned inward. I found one more ledger on her writing desk. The ink faded but legible. "Soil takes what man rejects. The fruit returns it pure. I left that night. I should have. But curiosity makes fools of all of us. Because even now, when I close my eyes, I see that orchard swaying. And I know, whatever she planted there isn't done growing. Would you have stayed to taste the fruit? If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most." By the time the stranger arrived at the gate, the house had been abandoned for nearly 70 years. He was a historian from Boston named Dr. Alaric Moore, traveling south to study the weather journals of the 1840s, records that were rumored to have survived in a few decaying plantations outside Savannah. When he reached the Whitcombe estate, the locals told him not to bother. They said the orchard had grown over the road, that no one had lived there since the war, that the place didn't keep guests. But historians are arrogant by nature, and Dr. Moore had no patience for ghost stories. The gate stood half open when he arrived, rusted at its hinges. The air inside the property was still, unnaturally so. The birds had gone silent, and the sound of his own breath felt too loud. The orchard had swallowed the path, its branches arching overhead like ribs. He pushed through them, the scent of spoiled peaches clinging to his clothes. The house appeared through the mist, still standing, though it shouldn't have been. A pale, columned ruin. The veranda sagged, the windows were blinded with grime. And yet, the door opened as if expecting him. Inside, dust floated like ash in the weak afternoon light. The floorboards sighed beneath each step. He set down his satchel, wiped his glasses, and tried to ignore the feeling that the house was breathing around him. He started with the study. Shelves of moldy books, a ledger half eaten by insects, pages filled with numbers and names, though many were scratched out violently as if erased in fury. One page, however, bore the phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life, line unbroken, blood secured. At first, he thought it a metaphor, a record of lineage. But then he found the second volume, tucked behind the fireplace bricks. It wasn't just names this time, it was measurements, weights, gestation dates, the tone clinical, detached, as if the author had been documenting livestock. He turned another page and froze. The ink was red, fresher than it should have been, and at the bottom of the page, his own surname was written, as if added later, Alaric Moore, descendant. He dropped the book. It hit the floor with a sound far heavier than paper should make. Something inside it shifted. When he dared open it again, a curl of dark hair fell out. Human. That night, he set up camp in the parlor. The orchard wind moved through the cracks like whispering breath. Somewhere outside, a branch tapped against the glass with unnatural rhythm, like a slow heartbeat. He could have sworn he heard footsteps on the veranda. He tried to convince himself it was the woods settling, but then the tapping stopped, and a voice spoke softly through the window pane. Home. He stumbled back, nearly toppling his lamp. No one was there, only the reflection of his own pale face. But when he looked closer, another reflection appeared behind his shoulder. A woman in a faded lace gown, her eyes hollow, her smile patient. He left the room without daring to look again. In the hallway, he found portraits, cracked, flaking, but still vivid. One showed a woman he recognized instantly from the stories, Eleanor Whitcomb. Her painted gaze followed him wherever he moved. Beneath her, two young men, identical but subtly distorted. Their faces were blurred, as if the artist had tried to paint over their expressions. And then, at the far end of the corridor, a newer portrait. Dust-free, untouched by time. It showed him. The same jawline, the same scar at the brow. A mirror image painted decades before his birth. His knees gave out. The house moaned around him, its boards creaking as if in laughter. In the morning, he fled to the nearest town and demanded church records, birth registries, marriage certificates. What he found made him retch. The Whitcomb family line didn't vanish in 1847. It changed its name in 1848 to Moore, the plantation's northern bookkeeper. The one who vanished after the scandal had been sent north with one of Eleanor's sons. They'd started over, carrying the bloodline in secret. Dr. Moore wasn't researching the Whitcombs. He was one. He returned to the estate that night, half in disbelief, half in madness. He said he had to see the ledger once more. The caretaker who sold him the property claimed he was still inside when the orchard began to hum again. The neighbors saw the trees moving, though there was no wind. When they searched for him days later, the parlor was empty. His satchel lay open on the floor, and beside it, a single ripe peach, warm to the touch. Inside, they found a tooth, Would you have kept reading that ledger? Or would you have run when you saw your own name? If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The house kept its last secret beneath the stairs. Dr. Moore, if he was still himself by that point, must have found the passage by accident. It lay behind a panel warped with age, the nails eaten through by moisture. He had been tracing the roots of his family's madness, the way any scholar would trace a sentence, and when his lantern brushed the wall, the panel shuddered. He pulled, and the wood came away in his hand, revealing a black mouth of stone descending into the earth. The smell that rose from it was not dust. It was salt and metal, like blood that had learned to breathe. He went down. There were 23 steps, each uneven. His lantern's light slid over the walls, showing layers of limestone cut smooth by human hands. Far below, a corridor opened into a wide chamber lined with mirrors. They weren't modern mirrors, they were pieces of polished tin, warped so that everything reflected. There seemed to move, to breathe. At the center of the room stood a table, oak, sturdy, stained dark. A cradle sat upon it, empty now, its blanket petrified by age. Candles ringed the cradle in a perfect circle, as if waiting to be lit again. This was the birth room, and even after a century, it smelled of milk and decay. Moore raised his lantern higher. The flame revealed portraits nailed to the far wall, portraits not painted but drawn in charcoal directly on stone. Dozens of faces, each one the same, a woman's hollow eyes, her smile faint, patient. Eleanor. The drawings overlapped, multiplying until her face became a pattern, until the whole wall seemed to breathe with her features. At his feet, the floor was scattered with bones. Small ones, infant-sized. He nearly slipped on one before realizing what it was. When he steadied himself, his hand brushed the cradle's frame, and a lullaby began to hum from somewhere deep within the walls. Not a recording, not an echo, a voice. Sleep now, sweet one. The roots will keep you warm. He froze. The words came again, softer, closer, line unbroken, blood secured. His light began to dim. He turned, and the mirrors shifted. In their warped reflection, a woman stood behind him. Her dress was the same faded lace, her hands folded neatly. Her face flickered between flesh and shadow. "Do you know why you're here?" she whispered. He tried to speak, but his throat locked. "You came to finish what I began," she said. "You came home." The cradle creaked. Something inside it moved. The blanket lifted slightly, as if stirred by breath. Moore stepped back, but his heel struck bone, and the sound echoed like a door closing. The woman, Eleanor, or whatever was left of her, moved closer. Her face flickered through the mirrors now. Hundreds of versions of her whispering the same words in unison. Blood cannot die if the soil remembers. The ground trembled. Roots, thin and pale, began to push through the cracks in the stone, coiling toward him. They wrapped around his ankles, climbed his legs like hands. The air turned hot and damp, and he could smell the orchard through the ceiling, its fruit ripening above him, its branches reaching down through the floors. He dropped the lantern, and darkness rushed in like water. Only the faint glow of the mirrors remained, pulsing with his reflection. When the caretaker found the cellar days later, it was empty again. The cradle sat in the same place, untouched, but the walls were damp, and from the ceiling, a few white roots hung, dripping something dark. And on the table, next to the cradle, was a new ledger. The first page bore a single line, Alaric Moore, returned to the soil. No one ever saw the historian again. But every few years, travelers report a light moving beneath the orchard at night, as if a lantern were swaying under the earth. Some say you can still hear the lullaby if you press your ear to the roots. Would you have gone down those steps? Or would you have sealed the wall forever? If you've stayed this long, You're braver than most." By the time the new heir arrived, the estate was only a rumor, a place the locals spoke of in half sentences, as though finishing the thought might wake something that had been sleeping. His name was Thomas Whitcomb Moore, and he came not as a historian, but as a descendant, though he didn't yet know it. He had inherited the property through a distant aunt who never spoke of her past. The letter from her solicitor was brief: keep the orchard tended, and keep the house closed. Thomas laughed when he read it. The superstition of old families. But still, he came. When he reached the estate, the orchard greeted him first. The trees leaned inward, their branches bowed low, heavy with fruit that shimmered strangely in the dusk. The air smelled thick, sweet, and faintly metallic. As he stepped between the rows, the hum of insects fell away. In that silence, he could almost hear breathing. Inside the house, time had frozen. The portraits still hung where they always had. Eleanor's face cracked but watchful, the son's eyes blotted into ghosts. A single chair sat before the hearth, as though waiting for him. On the mantel lay a book wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it. The pages were brittle, the ink gone brown, but the handwriting was unmistakably the same as his own. The final entry stopped him cold. If blood is memory, then the orchard is mind. It waits for me to remember. Below that, a blot, perhaps from a hand pressed too long against wet ink. Thomas spent his first night in the study. Around midnight, the orchard wind began to move. Each gust came slower than breath, each sigh whispering through the broken panes like words half spoken. He thought he heard his name. He went to the window. The trees below were shifting. Something was moving beneath them, roots or arms or both. The peaches glowed faintly, each pulsing as if with a heartbeat. He went outside. The air clung to him, syrupy. The fruit hung low, brushing his shoulders. And then one dropped at his feet, splitting open on the soil. Inside wasn't a pit. It was a small white shape, smooth, round, and glinting in the lantern light. A tooth. Thomas gagged. But the scent of the fruit was intoxicating, almost pleading. He picked another, warm. He bit into it. The taste was unlike anything he had known, sweet, metallic, alive. The juice ran down his chin, and for a moment he felt dizzy, weightless. Then came the voices. A chorus, soft, familiar, rising from the orchard, from the house, from the earth itself. Welcome home, Thomas. The fruit of her blood. The line unbroken. He stumbled backward, but the ground gave way beneath him. He fell through roots slick as veins, landing hard on stone. He was in the birthroom. The cradle was gone. The mirrors were dark. Only the table remained, and on it lay the rattle, the ledger, and a single candle burning without flame. From the shadows, she stepped forward. The lady of the orchards, Eleanor Whitcomb, or what the soil had made of her. Her dress shimmered like the skin of fruit, her eyes black with soil. My sons kept their promise, she said. Now you must keep yours. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The air itself had thickened, pressing against his mouth. You carry us, she whispered. Every seed needs its root. Every fruit must fall. The candle flared. The roots surged upward, wrapping his arms, his chest, drawing him toward the table. As they pulled tighter, he saw faces in the bark. Infant eyes, open mouths, generations looking back. He screamed once, but the soil filled his throat. The last thing he felt was warmth spreading through him, the hum of thousands of tiny hearts joining his own. By morning, the orchard was still. Only one new tree stood where the earth had been torn open, its leaves trembling though there was no wind. On its lowest branch, a single fruit ripened before noon, dark red, nearly black. The caretaker who found it refused to touch it. He swore he saw the shape of a man's face beneath the skin. He sealed the gate and left without another word. Now, every few years, When the summer heat turns heavy and the river fog creeps inland, people passing the old road say they can smell peaches and blood in the same breath. They say if you pick one fruit and bite deep enough, you'll taste the memory of every Whitcomb who ever lived. And if you listen closely, between the heartbeat and the hum, you'll hear her voice still tending the orchard. Sleep now, sweet one. The roots will keep you warm. Would you have tasted it too? If you've stayed this long, you're braver than most. The story fades the way the Georgia dusk does, slow, color by color, until only the outlines remain. The orchard is quiet now. The house sighs as it has for more than a century, its windows reflecting nothing but moonlight. Somewhere beneath those roots, the soil keeps its promises. You can almost imagine walking there at dawn, the dew on your shoes, the scent of fruit carried on the fog. If you pause long enough, you might feel the faint thrum of a heartbeat beneath your feet, like the land remembering a secret it can't quite forget. But maybe that's only the echo of all we've heard tonight. The whispers of legacy, guilt, and the strange hunger of memory. It's easier to think that, isn't it? That these are just stories. Close your eyes. Let the orchard fade. Let the voices grow still. Picture the candle burning low, a thread of smoke curling toward the ceiling, leaving behind only silence. Some truths are kinder when left buried, some fruit sweeter if never tasted. Like, share and subscribe if you made it this far. And don't forget to comment below where you're watching from and at what time. Tell me what topic the next story should be about. The ones who stayed till the end, you're the bravest. I'm surprised you're still here. Sleep if you can.